My name is Victoria Orchard, and in coordination with the University of St. Thomas Geography and Environmental Studies program, I was able to produce this analysis exploring how protected lands affect costs of living for vulnerable populations. In recent years, studies establishing the direct correlations between nature and humans' physical and mental health have been published far and wide. We know that green spaces, such as protected parks and natural areas, promote higher activity levels and general health of the communities overall. It is important to consider the after effects of protection of land and the changes that take place in the community. Because of the socioeconomic changes that take place when land is protected, it is necessary to consider the stratification that may be amplified by these changes. Currently, we know that environmental justice studies have proven the distribution of environmental amenities is disproportionate to socioeconomically vulnerable populations. This has continually resulted in these areas becoming great opportunities for new green spaces and protected parks, but the zoning and real estate practices that change because of this green space introductions are controversial. We know this is happening in many places across the United States, one specifically being Baltimore, Maryland. Here they found a distinct disparity of parks throughout low-income areas, whereas high-income areas generally had more green space. This issue, now widely accepted, has led to the creation of many green spaces in vulnerably populated communities. But I'm not here to discuss things we already know. Beyond the introduction of green space being great for physical and mental health, there are many changes that take place in a community after the introduction of protected lands, such as parks and natural areas. Often these spaces are meant to address environmental injustices of disproportionate green space, but in turn, they have a large effect on the community's economy. We know that these green places increase housing costs, property taxes, and cost of living for diverse populations. As put by the research team at Landscape and Urban Planning, ultimately, this can lead to gentrification and a displacement of the very residents that the green space strategies were designed to benefit. It is hard to wrap our minds around the fact that our introduction of green space into these areas that need it most might not have the long-term positive socioeconomic outcomes we had hoped for. Studies have found that even when neighborhoods do have the recommended amount of green space per capita, there is a considerable difference in spatial analysis with respect to certain economic, ethnic, and religious groups. These results are unfortunate. As far back as 1994, it was declared by law that environmental justice considerations must be made in all forms, including development, but still, we have failed to address the long-term effects of access after the implementation of green space and protected lands. With each year pushing the socioeconomic disparities and stratification borders far beyond the limits of years before, it is now that we find social equality one of the most important and highly regarded issues of the public. Now more than ever, we need to consider all the effects of our green space initiatives so that these places can benefit and be enjoyed by those intended. So what are we to do about it? Knowing how protected lands affect vulnerable communities allows for the creation of policy to address the disproportion that often follows implementation. This research will look at these communities across the United States to spatially analyze where these events are taking place. Based on this, I ask, where are protected lands? In these areas, will vulnerable populations experience the benefits originally intended on a long-term scale? And how does policy, or lack thereof, affect these areas? Using this model for analysis, I was able to look more closely at how land in the United States is protected by gap status, and from there to compare socioeconomic factors like percent minority and percent low income. First, it is necessary to understand where protected lands of the United States are located. Most of our gap status 1 and 2, which are the most protected, are located in the western portion of our country. If we look solely at the gap status 1 and 2 areas, it is quite clear that other than the west, coastal areas are targets as well. Next, looking back at the model, I used a feature to raster and reclassify tool to merge gap status 1 and 2 lands into a single layer. This layer presents the United States on a 2-color scale, green being protected lands and white lands with little to no protection. Following this, I used an environmental justice layer to display low income percent and minority percent in rasters. This map, showing low income percentage for high and low in orange, with gap status protected lands in green, shows some areas of significance. First, we have this area near the Four Corners that has one of the highest concentrations of low income percent communities, but is entirely surrounded by protected lands. Some of these other areas show signs of the same pattern across the states. Next, looking at the minority percent raster, again with gap status in green, we can tell some of the same areas are spatially correlated in terms of minority percent as well. This area near the Four Corners, as well as the other few, all show our most intense disparities. Using both minority percentage and low income percentage, I was able to create a raster of vulnerable populations in the United States. This combination of socioeconomic factors yields concrete evidence that there are communities, although entirely surrounded or nearby to protected lands, that still face major environmental justice issues that arise after implementation of protection, causing higher housing costs, property taxes, and costs of living. The EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people. Inside of this, I think it is important that we take our best efforts of introducing green space and ensure that these benefits will be received by those intended and over a long period of time. So, in conclusion to this analysis, I'd like to reiterate a few points. In order to address our environmental justice goals, we must consider what happens to the community after land is protected. Effects like rising housing costs, property taxes, and costs of living can make living in such areas nearly impossible for vulnerable populations. Moving forward, considerations of these long-term effects is essential to promoting long-term benefits for vulnerable communities. We can start to mitigate these negative side effects by locking in rates and property taxes for vulnerable communities when protecting land. These green space initiatives are what is moving environmental justice in our country forward. It is our responsibility to ensure everyone reaps the most benefits for as long as possible. Finally, I'd like to take a minute to mention the sources and data that made this presentation possible. Thank you.